Army Men Sarge's Heroes 2 is a game with which I am quite familiar on the Nintendo 64. And unlike the other Army Men games that I've reviewed for Game Boy Color, I've actually had the Game Boy Color port of this since I was a kid. I remember getting it in my Easter basket when I was 8 or 9 years old, and being so excited to play it because of how much I loved the Nintendo 64 original. But I also remember being pretty disappointed when I did play it, because at that age I had no idea of the concept of hardware capabilities, or that the Game Boy Color was capable of significantly less than the Nintendo 64. Going back through this game as an adult, however, it's become clear to me that I was disappointed in all the wrong things. That's not to say this game isn't disappointing. There are a lot of reasons to be disappointed here, but none of those stuck out to me when I was a kid. One of the first things that stuck out to me in this playthrough was what a drastic departure this game was from the story of the original console game. I expected a significantly slimmed down version, like what we had in Army Men and Army Men Air Combat, or even a somewhat loosely based story, like Army Men 2 on the Game Boy Color. But this is completely unrelated for the most part. It really doesn't have anything to do with the console versions of Sarge's Heroes 2, except for the names of the characters and the nebulous goal of defeat General Plastro. Otherwise, it's totally different. There's no portal to the real world, even though that's literally on the cover to the game. There's no real interaction with half of Bravo Squad. Not a single mention of the Blue Army or their femme fatale spy, Bridget Blue. I could handle a super watered down rendition of the story, but not even trying to keep the storyline common, that's a huge letdown. Of the other 4 Game Boy Color Army Men games, I would say that in general, Sarge's Heroes 2 looks the best. The vehicle models aren't the most attractive, but the overall game does have a pretty decent look to it. Unfortunately, this seems to come with a pretty big hit to performance. The game didn't just slow down, it absolutely chugged in places. While this generally seemed to happen in areas with a lot of tan units to destroy, there would be other times that it seemed to drag for no reason I could find, as well as times with a fairly large number of enemies on screen that didn't have any noticeable delay. It was a curious and frustrating thing, but it wasn't frequent or severe enough for me to really call it game-breaking. It's definitely something to note as a con, and it was disappointing, but it's not something that would ruin an otherwise great game. Unfortunately, this is not an otherwise great game. I mentioned in my other Army Men Game Boy Color reviews that music tended to get annoyingly repetitive. Apparently, 3DO's solution to this was to take the music out entirely. Now the game has just an uncomfortable silence, broken only by the repetitive sounds of your weapons. Whoosh, 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 on and on. It's not exactly an improvement. There are no voice clips aside from the of a tan soldier's death, but that's so distorted it hardly even sounds like a scream. All in all, the sound design is an even bigger disappointment than the lack of coherent story here. With a poor storyline, horrendous sound design, and lackluster performance, surely the overall gameplay itself was good, right? Well, kind of. The control is decent enough, and once you get used to them, the missions are fairly fun. There are several missions, however, that require you to switch between a boat and a tank several times, and that switch is very finicky. You press select to switch when you're in proximity of the other vehicle, but it apparently has to be a very precise distance. Stay too far away, and it obviously won't work. Get too close, and it also won't work. You have to be just close enough, but not too close. And there doesn't seem to be a huge amount of consistency as to exactly how close or how far you need to be from one instance of switching vehicles to the next. The missions also vary wildly in length. I'd be finishing the early missions in 2 or 3 minutes, whereas some of the later missions would take me nearly half an hour. I'm all for having missions that get more difficult and longer as the game progresses, but to go from a minute and a half to nearly 30 minutes? That seems a little excessive to me. Army Men Sarge's Heroes 2 on the Game Boy Color is not the worst of the 4 main series Army Men games on the platform, but it is the second worst, only after the Game Boy Color port of the original Army Men. It's a shame, too, because it had potential. Had they just followed even just the most major events of the console Army Men Sarge's Heroes 2 story, and gotten some of the performance issues smoothed out, this would have been a genuinely good handheld experience. As it is now, however, it serves only to sit on a shelf and disappoint Army Men fans who were hoping to experience Sergeant Hawk's exploits on the go. As is the case with most of the Army Men handheld games, if you're a big fan of the series, it's worth picking up and playing through to experience. If you are a huge Game Boy Color collector, this is a pretty decent and probably fairly inexpensive game to add to your collection. But if you're just a run-of-the-mill gamer, skip it. There's nothing here that's going to appeal to you. My rating for Army Men Sarge's Heroes 2 on the Game Boy Color is a D.